My name is Brenda Sanders. At 26, as a young prosecutor, I reunited with a person who had been under suspicion for the first time in 15 years. That person, Mario Johnson, was a wealthy man and the person my mother Leslie had remarried, thus my stepfather. He was affluent, owning a large amount of property and land, but there were rumors that he was evading taxes. The Tax Bureau had been investigating him several times over the past few years, but they had been unable to find any evidence. Now, after a long-term investigation, they finally produced results and led to a prosecution. I coincidentally became in charge of this case. There is an indescribable feeling about having my stepfather as my first prosecution case. On the day of the trial, my stepfather and I crossed paths in the hallway of the courthouse. I immediately recognized him as my stepfather, whom I had not seen for 15 years. He looked a bit older and thinner, but his sharp gaze and the aura that kept people at bay hadn't changed. In fact, it seemed that his gaze had become even harsher due to his weight loss. My stepfather did not notice me and was about to pass by, so I instinctively called out to him. "Long time no see, it's me, Brenda. You took great care of us when my mother was well." Startled by my sudden call, my stepfather turned around, and it seemed he didn't recognize me at first but remembered after hearing my name. "Brenda? The kid who used to boss other kids around without properly finishing school? What are you doing here? Are you going into prison or something?" He laughed as he walked away. I first met my stepfather about 2 years after my biological father had passed away. At that time, I was a lower elementary school student, and my mother and I went to an amusement park. My stepfather was waiting at the entrance. My mother introduced him to me, and the three of us played in the amusement park, but occasionally my stepfather's cold gaze at me made me scared and unable to enjoy the time. However, my mother clearly enjoyed herself, and seeing her smile after a long time excited me, and I fell asleep on my stepfather's back as we were leaving. Later, he started coming to our house for meals and going out with us more frequently. From the outside, it might have seemed like everything was going well, but when my mother was not around, my stepfather would complain and I could not accept him. "I am under no obligation to take care of you. I want to be with your mother. You are a nuisance." While he spoke kindly to me in front of my mother, my stepfather always said this when she was not around. My stepfather tended to look down on others and had an arrogant personality. I heard that his previous wife had run away from him. He couldn't do household chores or cook, and the house was always a mess. Seeing this, a friend of his introduced my mother as a housekeeper, which led to their acquaintance. Initially, when my mother was introduced to him, my stepfather was immediately enchanted by her and soon proposed a relationship, but it was rejected because of my presence. My mother revealed that she had a child from her deceased husband and intended to cut off the relationship, but my stepfather insisted it was not a problem and repeatedly requested to maintain a relationship. Eventually, my mother yielded to my stepfather's persistent advances and they started dating. However, I was despised by my stepfather, and I rebelled against him, often causing problems at school. Every time I caused trouble, my mother felt she was bothering my stepfather and hesitated to marry him. But he argued that marrying him would settle me down, and eventually, they married a year after they started dating. After the marriage, my surname was not changed and remained my mother's maiden name, while my mother took my stepfather's surname. This was out of my stepfather's consideration, thinking that changing the surname might lead to bullying at school. The new house we moved into was very spacious, and it was apparent that it was a wealthy household. Since my mother had previously worked as a housekeeper, the house was always well organized, and expensive vases were displayed in the living room. My mother showed me around the new house and took me to my new room on the second floor. The room was equipped with a new study desk and bed, and in my excitement, I jumped into the bed, followed by my mother. I was happy to receive a new room, but living with my stepfather increased my heartache, and I gradually felt myself becoming unruly. I never felt at peace while living in that house. Gradually, I attended school less often, and as a result, my mother was called by the school and advised to transfer me to another school. Seeing my mother distressed, my stepfather treated me even colder, and observing how much I despised him, my mother seemed to be suffering between us. My stepfather had married my mother despite opposition from his family and relatives, and he felt that my poor reputation at school was tarnishing his image, which severely deteriorated our relationship. Sometimes when he was in a good mood, my stepfather would talk to me, but when I ignored him, he couldn't hide his irritation and said, "I'm trying to talk to you, and this is the attitude you give me." My mother was always calm in front of such behavior and apologized, saying, "Please don't say that. She's very shy and needs time to open up. That's why I was hesitant about getting married. I'm really sorry for putting both of you through this." This exchange repeated itself, and I started to stay in my room whenever he was home to avoid him. Before the marriage, my stepfather never complained about me in front of my mother, but as soon as we started living together, his attitude changed completely, and I think my mother was greatly puzzled by his transformation. She had dreamed of the three of us enjoying meals together peacefully after getting married, but the reality was the exact opposite. Since I refused to join them for meals, my mother, considering my feelings, would bring food to my room and say, "Brenda, I'm sorry. I've caused you pain by remarrying, but, it was tough for me to support us on my own income. Your dad isn't really a bad person. I wish you could understand that." Although my mother consoled me this way, she might have foreseen this situation. That's probably why she hesitated to remarry. That's how I feel now. 3 years after remarrying my stepfather, during the summer, my mother fell ill. At that time, I was in the 6th grade of elementary school. When her illness was discovered, she was given a terminal diagnosis, but she decided to undergo surgery, believing in recovery. "Brenda, I'm really sorry to worry you. If I have this surgery, I can be healthy again. Once I'm better, I'd love for the three of us to go to the amusement park again. I have to keep living until I see you become a middle school student this coming April." Before the surgery, my mother spoke to me with such determination. After the surgery, there was no improvement in her condition, and it was visibly evident that her body was deteriorating. Each time he saw my mother's condition, my stepfather was deeply disappointed, drowned his sorrows in alcohol at night, and often took out his drunken frustration on me. When I locked myself in my room, he would yell to open the door, and when I refused, he would break the door to enter, insult me, and then leave the room when he was satisfied. This continued almost daily. 6 months after being admitted to the hospital, my mother passed away without overcoming her illness. During her hospital visits, my mother was always worried about my stepfather and me. She said, "Brenda, I hope you and your father get along. If I can't come back from the hospital, I'm worried about your future. I've asked your father to take care of you until you graduate from high school. He promised, so please listen to him and be a good girl." Concerned more for me than for herself, I lied to keep her from worrying. "It's okay. Mom, I'm getting along fine with him, so don't worry and come back home healthy." 3 days later, during lunch break while I was playing in the schoolyard, the vice principal and my teacher suddenly came to deliver the news of my mother's death. "Your grandfather just called, and unfortunately, your mother has passed away. Your grandparents are coming to pick you up, so get ready and wait at the school gate." I couldn't understand what had happened right away when I heard these words. The part about getting ready was the only thing that immediately registered, so I went back to the classroom and started packing my things. While packing, the vice principal's words echoed in my mind. "Mom has died. Mom is dead." These words echoed over and over in my head, and my friends, who looked worried, talked to me while I was packing. "Brenda, what's wrong? Why are you leaving suddenly?" "My mom, she's passed away. My mom has." "Wait, your mom passed away? With no dad around, what are you going to do now?" "I don't know, but my grandparents are coming to pick me up, so I have to wait at the school gate." With those words, I left the classroom and headed to the school gate. About 20 minutes later, my grandparents arrived to pick me up, and we headed to the hospital in my grandfather's car, which was utterly silent inside, and no one spoke a word. When we entered my mother's hospital room, I saw my stepfather holding my mother's cold hand and crying. When he noticed us, he quietly wiped his tears and left the room. Following my grandfather's urging, I approached my mother, who looked as if she were just sleeping peacefully. I shook her body and called out to her, hoping somehow for a response, but there was none. Mom, wake up, please. Mom, I'll do anything you say. I'll help with the chores, anything. Please wake up, Mom." Hearing my heartfelt plea, my grandmother, moved to tears, broke down, and my grandfather gently supported her. After a while, a nurse came in to carefully clean my mother's body and started tidying up the room, making the surroundings suddenly busy. In the meantime, funeral home staff arrived and began preparations to transport my mother. My mother's body was placed on a stretcher and loaded into a funeral home vehicle that was waiting outside, and then it was taken to the funeral parlor. I also got into the car with my grandparents and followed the funeral home's vehicle to the funeral parlor. Upon arrival, preparations for my mother's funeral were already underway. My grandfather asked for the location of the waiting room, and when we moved there, we saw my mother being placed there. My stepfather was also in the room with the funeral home staff. After the meeting, my stepfather gently pushed me aside as I stood by my mother's side and sat next to her. He must have loved her deeply. He looked at her face with a sorrow I had never seen before. After my mother was carefully washed and made up, she looked as beautiful as when she was alive, her face almost seeming to smile. During the funeral, I had no chance to think about my own future after her death. Amidst the busyness, I was seated in the family section and continued to bow repeatedly to the visiting mourners, imitating what I saw. When the funeral successfully concluded and the cremains were taken home, my stepfather declared a disownment in front of the gathered relatives. "Brenda, as of today, you and I are nothing to each other. You are free to go wherever you like." My stepfather coldly continued, "I married your mother, but I never considered you as my daughter. That's why I never made any legal arrangements, nor do I intend to leave you any inheritance. Your mother is gone. There is no reason to keep you here, so get out now." After these words, my stepfather went up to my room and threw my belongings, clothes, backpack, and textbooks out of the second-floor window. My maternal relatives were shocked by this, while my stepfather's relatives laughed mockingly. As I stood dumbfounded, my grandparents quietly gathered the scattered belongings, took my hand, and led me to the car to take me to my mother's parental home. During the ride, my grandparents comforted me with warm words. "Brenda, from now on, we, your grandparents, will support you firmly, so you don't need to worry. Just going to school is enough. Let's start preparing for your transfer tomorrow. It's been tough recently, you've done well. Take a rest tomorrow and relax." With these words, upon arrival at my mother's parental home, I had dinner early and immediately went to sleep. My mother's parental home was far from the school district I had previously attended, and the next day, my grandparents were busy with the preparations for my transfer. On the last day before the transfer, my classmates from my previous school held a farewell party for me. Since I had caused various problems at school, my transfer might have been sudden, but perhaps it was a relief for my teacher. At the farewell party, my classmates said things that seemed to express their sadness even as they laughed, and although I was internally irritated, I felt no particular attachment to this school or the classmates. After the farewell party, I stopped by my stepfather's house and was able to collect my late mother's belongings. This was something my grandparents had asked my stepfather to retrieve, and I was glad to feel my mother close by. Afterward, I started attending a new elementary school, but due to my shy nature, I initially struggled to get along with my classmates and sometimes got into fights and caused problems. The school had concerns and invited my grandfather to discuss my discipline, which was apparently quite strict. Despite this, my grandparents never scolded me but raised me with the utmost love. Moved by their demeanor, I gradually began to take a keen interest in my studies. When I became a middle school student, exam scores were published, and my competitive spirit came to the forefront, prompting me to study even harder. By the third year of middle school, I was consistently among the top students in my class. While I wished I could show this change to my mother, my grandparents wept with joy at my transformation. In front of my mother's portrait, I felt that she too was happy with my growth. Also, I almost stopped getting into fights and couldn't stand to see other students being bullied, which earned me respect from my classmates. Gradually, a sense of justice developed within me, and I began to harbor vague dreams about my future. During career counseling in the third year of middle school, my homeroom teacher introduced me to the profession of a prosecutor, which became my new goal. I did not fully understand the specifics of a prosecutor's job at that time, but was drawn to the sound of the profession. To become a prosecutor, it is common to study at a university with a law school, and then advance to law school to take the bar exam, as explained by my teacher, and I decided to aim for a high school with a high advancement rate. With the support of my grandparents, I was able to enroll in the high school I had hoped for. Having a goal, I lived a vibrant high school life, and time flew by quickly. As university entrance exams approached, I expressed my desire to attend a certain private university in New York during a three-way interview. However, living with my grandparents commuting to a private university in New York was difficult, and I considered boarding, but my grandfather told me that it would be tough to cover both lodging and tuition with their pension. Even working part-time, I wouldn't have enough funds, so I decided to choose a university that I could commute to from home. Upon investigation, I found that a nearby university offers a tuition waiver for students who rank within the top 10. Therefore, I worked hard on my studies for the university entrance exams and successfully passed. As a result, I was able to receive a tuition waiver from the university, allowing me to study without placing a financial burden on my grandparents. University life was busy with part-time jobs and lectures, and the 4 years passed by in a flash. Maintaining good grades was challenging, but the sense of achievement deepened my self-confidence. Seeing my grandparents happy with my efforts gave me even more energy. Then, after advancing to graduate school, I accidentally heard some unpleasant rumors about my stepfather from a friend I encountered. It happened the moment I got on the train to go to university. Just before the doors closed, I rushed into the train and, while taking a breath, looked up to find myself making eye contact with someone my age. I felt like I had seen that face somewhere before, and as I recalled, I realized he was a classmate from elementary school. It was the same friend who had spoken to me when I was preparing to leave after hearing of my mother's death. Without hesitation, I spoke to him. "I'm Brenda Sanders. We were together in elementary school. Do you remember?" My friend responded with surprise. "Ah, Brenda, the one who moved away in 6th grade when your mom passed away? You've become much kinder in appearance. What are you doing now? Still a student?" "Yes, I'm attending a local graduate school, studying law to become a prosecutor." "That's surprising. I'm actually at the same graduate school too. What a coincidence." "Oh, and about your father. It seems a lot has happened since you left home." He then told me about the events that occurred after my stepfather and I parted ways. His house was near my stepfather's, so he knew a lot about my stepfather's recent situation. According to him, shortly after I took my late mother's belongings, my stepfather started living with another woman. She was considerably younger with a flashy appearance, and there were rumors in the neighborhood that she was after my stepfather's inheritance. My stepfather was proudly introducing his new young wife to everyone around, unaware of the bad reputation she had in the community. While they appeared to be living a happy marital life on the surface, one day my stepfather was rushed to the hospital after being served a meal suspected of containing poison. Fortunately, his life was not in danger, and he was able to be discharged from the hospital after a short period. After the incident, my stepfather reported his wife to the police and has since lived without forming deep relationships with anyone. Following the incident, he began distancing himself from people and continued to say he wouldn't leave his property to anyone, becoming isolated. There had been rumors of tax evasion about my stepfather before, but the incident reignited them, and the tax bureau visited his house. When I mentioned this to my grandparents, they were also aware of my stepfather's bad reputation. "We didn't want to tell you, Brenda, but your mother had sensed his tax evasion. She seemed distressed over money, and maybe it was for the best that you severed ties with that man. He was evading taxes since back then, and he still hasn't been caught. He always knew when the tax bureau was coming. That's why he was able to escape without his books being seized. He's cautious and has hired excellent lawyers. It might be hard to catch him." I wondered if, as a prosecutor, I would one day face my stepfather in court. At that time, I felt conflicted about my relationship with my stepfather. Before becoming a prosecutor, I sincerely hoped he would be caught. Graduate school passed by in the blink of an eye. The annual pass rate for the bar exam was about 30% to 35%, and it was the most focused study experience I had ever had. I understood that without such effort, passing would be difficult. Indeed, my grandparents' support was crucial in preparing for the bar exam. There was a time when I was torn between quitting my job to focus on studying for the exam or continuing to work while studying. I was worried that if I quit my job, I wouldn't be able to pay living expenses to my grandparents. So I gathered the courage to discuss my situation with them. "Grandpa, Grandma, I have something to discuss. I'm busy preparing for the bar exam, and it's hard to keep up with work. But if I quit, I won't be able to afford living expenses. What do you think I should do?" To this question, my grandmother answered with a gentle smile. "Don't worry, we have been saving all the living expenses you've been giving us." Then, She took out a passbook from the drawer and showed me the balance. "Please focus on your studies. You don't need to worry about money. Grandpa and I had hoped you would rely on us more, but we respect how independent you always are. Don't worry, just concentrate on your exam." With my anxiety alleviated, I immersed myself in preparing for the bar exam, and studying late into the night became my routine. Thanks to the dedicated support from my grandmother, who prepared midnight snacks for me, I was able to pass the bar exam on my first attempt. After graduating, I started my career at the prosecutor's office, and the first case I handled was my stepfather, Mario Johnson's tax evasion case. Despite multiple attempts by the tax bureau, my stepfather had evaded prosecution. While feeling uneasy, I thoroughly reviewed his ledgers and past indictments. Judging that prosecution was difficult with the current evidence alone, I explored other methods for possible prosecution. Remembering that my mother knew about the tax evasion, I suspected him of having poisoned her, and decided to meet with his ex-wife who was in prison. The meeting resulted in obtaining decisive evidence that led to prosecution. I am investigating Mario's tax evasion issue. If you know anything, please tell me. First, are you aware that he was committing tax evasion? Yes, he discloses information voluntarily to those he trusts. He is quite proficient with the hiding places for his ledgers and how to manipulate them. Really? Could you provide me with those details if possible? By proceeding with a plea bargain, there is a possibility to reduce your sentence. I understand. Then I will also cooperate. The ex-wife explained the situation candidly, and after returning to the prosecutor's office, I proceeded with a detailed corroborative investigation. When it came time to testify in court, I asked the ex-wife to testify about my stepfather's tax evasion methods, and she agreed immediately. After obtaining solid evidence of the tax evasion, I summoned my stepfather to court. On the day of the trial, as I passed my stepfather in the hallway of the courthouse, I addressed him. He responded as he had 15 years ago. "Brenda? The kid who used to boss other kids around without properly finishing school. What are you doing here? Are you going into prison or something?" As he was about to leave laughing, I stopped and said, "This is the prosecutor's office. The one going behind bars is you." Hearing this, my stepfather's face suddenly changed. "You've become a prosecutor. Well, the U.S. is finished. It's a wonder how someone who barely finished elementary school can become a prosecutor. You didn't think you'd be prosecuting me, did you? Many have tried and failed. I don't think you stand a chance. Considering all the trouble I've taken care of you when you were young, keep that in mind during the trial," he said while laughing, as he headed to the courtroom. I went back to the office to gather some documents, and then entered the courtroom feeling composed. When my stepfather saw me in court, he smiled and began to speak. "Well, if it isn't my daughter, do you really think you can judge me?" His words caused a stir in the courtroom, and there were murmurs of surprise. Without being disturbed by his provocation, I calmly responded, "That was 15 years ago. Moreover, I was never formally adopted, so we are not family. Even if you were my biological father, those who break the law need to be punished. That's why I became a prosecutor." Hearing my response, the judge cautioned us to refrain from personal conversations. My stepfather's laughter echoed through the courtroom, and the atmosphere was tense. The trial formally began, and as I read the indictment, my stepfather's attorney started the defense. This attorney's excellence was widely recognized, and it was his skill that had contributed to previous non-prosecution decisions. My stepfather, having seen the charges I filed, seemed to expect a non-prosecution this time as well, and looked relaxed as he spoke with his attorney. "Your Honor, the charges presented lack sufficient evidence. Further proceedings would be pointless. Could we move to close the court soon?" My stepfather confidently stated this. When the judge asked me if there was any additional evidence, I presented decisive proof. "Your Honor, I have summoned a witness who is well versed in Mr. Johnson's methods of tax evasion. May I request her testimony in court?" This request caused a stir in the courtroom, and my stepfather and his attorney could not hide their disturbance. "Granted, please call the witness." With the attorney's agreement, I called the witness from outside into the courtroom. As the courtroom door opened and all eyes turned in that direction, my stepfather recognized his ex-wife and lost color in his face. "Why is she here?" "Your Honor, this woman has harmed me before. Please do not believe her words." The judge noted his panic and commanded him to remain quiet. Mr. Johnson, please remain silent. We will consider the witness's statement. Let's listen. I object. This woman has a criminal past. Are we to believe the words of a prisoner? The prosecution is too biased. The unexpected appearance of the witness clearly unsettled the attorney. The judge had the witness announce their name and swear to speak truthfully before taking their testimony. While supplementing the witness's account, I submitted relevant evidential documents to pressure my stepfather. After the testimony concluded, the judge declared that the verdict would be delivered in 1 week and adjourned the session for the day. Mario recognized that the situation was unfavorable to him and left the courtroom complaining to his lawyer. After he left, I exhaled a sigh of relief and was surprised at how composed I had been. My colleagues praised me, filling me with a sense of accomplishment. I eagerly awaited the official verdict, hoping the charges would be upheld. 1 week later, the judge announced the verdict, and Mario was sentenced to actual prison time. Thus, the long battle between the tax bureau and Mario Johnson came to an end. Mario, who could not accept the verdict, vehemently criticized me. I took care of you, and this is how you repay me. You repay kindness with betrayal. I intend to appeal. Be prepared. When he approached shouting, security quickly intervened and escorted him out of the courthouse. 2 weeks later, Mario's appeal was dismissed, and he appeared at the prosecutor's office before being sent to a correctional facility. When I saw him at the prosecutor's office, he looked significantly thinner and unwell. I faced him briefly and then left politely. Afterward, Mario relinquished all his properties, paid the additional taxes and bail, and then disappeared from his residence, becoming untraceable. Meanwhile, having successfully prosecuted Mario, who had previously been unconvictable, I gained much practical experience and became a noted newcomer at the prosecutor's office. Later, I married my long-term partner who happily accepted living with my grandparents. He is a regular office worker with a very kind personality. Living together with my grandparents posed no issues for him, and he cared for their health and daily life even more than I did. 1 year after our marriage, I found out I was pregnant, but we have not confirmed the baby's gender. If it's a girl, we plan to name her after my mother, Leslie, and when I told my grandparents, they were delighted. My grandparents are very fond of my husband and eagerly await the birth of our child. Having lost my parents at a young age and grown up without knowing their love, I don't know what I would have done without the support of my grandparents. Perhaps I grew up not knowing how to show affection. However, thanks to my grandparents' loving care, I was able to reform myself and pursue a career as a prosecutor. It is thanks to my grandparents taking me in that day that I am here now. Being abandoned by my stepfather surprisingly led to a positive turn in my life. I do not want my coming child to feel lonely, and no matter what kind of child is born, I hope to give them the deep affection that my grandparents showed me. As my pregnancy progressed, I reflected on everything from my childhood to the present. I gave birth safely, and it was a girl. My husband was overjoyed by this news, and my grandparents were very happy, which made me feel deeply fulfilled. Currently, I am taking a break from work, but I plan to balance parenting and my career moving forward. Since Dad will be gone soon, I'll just endure it for a while longer. You are terrible, Greg, aren't you? Although, lately I may have been viewing him solely in terms of financial worth. A discomforting conversation between a brother and his wife. I happened to overhear this conversation, and my father's face looked sadder than ever, causing me unbearable pain. As I stood next to my dad, unable to remain silent, I reached for the doorknob to interrupt, but he grabbed my hand and shook his head. Don't worry. There's just one thing I need help with. The unexpected measure he was considering against my brother and his wife was. I am Susan Owen. At 58, I work at a local osteopathic clinic, handling reception and miscellaneous duties. I am the same age as my husband, Robert, and we have a 28-year-old daughter. We married at 25, and after struggling to conceive, our daughter was born when I was 30 following fertility treatments. She recently decided to marry and moved out of the house. While I sometimes feel lonely, having been used to living with 3 people, I am happy about my daughter's marriage. I have always wanted to avoid conflicts and live peacefully, but specific individuals were threatening that desire. My brother Greg has a completely opposite personality, aggressive, and I've disliked his mischief since childhood. As a child, he destroyed a plush toy I was attached to and deliberately attached insects I disliked to me. Particularly memorable was when he released a cherished goldfish I got into a river. I remember crying a lot then, and I still haven't forgotten it. As Greg became an adult and started living alone, our interactions significantly decreased, and I was relieved internally. I had hoped to keep contact with him to a minimum, but surprisingly, Robert and Greg were working at the same company. When Robert got the job, I knew he was at the same company as Greg, but since they were in different departments, I intentionally did not tell Robert, as I tried to minimize my involvement with Greg. Robert, like me, was a pacifist and disliked conflicts. His gentle nature was greatly appreciated by my parents. We had been dating since college, considering marriage from the start, and had already met both families. As Robert took on a significant project at work, succeeded, and was smoothly promoted, our life stabilized, and we decided to marry. Around that time, Greg brought the woman he wanted to marry, Kate, who became a factor in disturbing my peaceful life. One day, while we were relaxing on the couch at home, the doorbell rang. I'm back, and I've brought her with me. That moment was my first encounter with Kate, and her personality was vastly different from mine, similar to my brother's. Kate, a classmate of Greg's, was 2 years older than me, had light brown hair and flashy makeup that spoke of her restlessness. Although one shouldn't judge based on appearance alone, the moment I saw her, I couldn't help but feel that our worldviews were different. Nice to meet you, I'm Greg's sister, Susan. Hope we'll get along. In response to my greeting, Kate looked me up and down coldly and said, "Oh, you're Susan. It's troublesome that we're getting married at the same time." Well, can't be helped. Looking forward to it. I felt slightly uncomfortable with her way of speaking. We had been planning our marriage for a long time, and although I had already discussed it with our parents, being spoken to in such a manner was irritating, but I kept my emotions hidden since it was our first meeting. "That's right, Kate, right? I'd be happy if you're kind to our daughter. Let's all get along and live peacefully." My father, a well-regarded pediatrician in this area for many years, immediately followed up. Always smiling, gentle, and warm-hearted, I have yet to meet someone who dislikes my father. I wanted a stable life because I grew up watching my parents. While I resisted a tumultuous life like something out of a TV drama, meeting Kate gave me a bad feeling. After our marriage, Greg and I were living peacefully, but a sudden incident changed everything. It was Robert's promotion. Greg was older and had been at the company longer than Robert, but Robert was promoted and became Greg's direct supervisor. This company didn't follow the typical seniority system, it adopted a meritocracy. Robert's work was very meticulous, and he responded precisely where needed. From his capabilities, he was deeply trusted and valued by both upper management and colleagues. His promotion was decided without a single objection, following the success of a major project he undertook before our marriage. An old colleague of mine who works at the same place occasionally gives me inside information. When my father invited us home to celebrate Robert's promotion, he didn't inform Greg, considering his feelings, but Greg saw our car and came to our home because he lived nearby. "What are you doing, Dad?" Excluding us and preparing a luxurious meal. "Do you prioritize your son-in-law over your own son?" They really were. "It's unforgivable how they're treating you, Greg, so poorly when you're already down about not getting a promotion." The two vented their illogical anger. The celebration was supposed to start in a cheerful atmosphere, but it was ruined by this sudden event. It's not like that. Greg is important too, but Robert is already my son. It's natural to celebrate good news. If you're upset, I apologize. So my innocent father apologized. "Dad, don't apologize." "Greg, my promotion is also thanks to everyone's support. How about we skip the celebration tonight and just enjoy the delicious food?" When Robert suggested this, the two reluctantly sat down and enjoyed the meal together. After dinner, while relaxing in the living room, we told my father about our fertility treatment. "I see, actually, we were also blessed with you and Greg through fertility treatment." I was astonished by this new fact. "Really? I had no idea. Was the process difficult?" "It was tough for Mom. There wasn't much I could do." "What are you talking about?" "It was because of Dad's cooperation that we could have children." This affectionate exchange was comforting. Knowing there were successful examples of fertility treatment around us motivated us to keep trying. However, Greg and Kate, who were upstairs, came down and interrupted with a disdainful tone, "What, Susan is receiving fertility treatment?" Afterward, Kate whispered something to Greg. "Actually, I was going to wait until the second trimester, but I'm actually pregnant." The sudden confession of pregnancy started. Everyone seemed unable to hide their surprise. "Ah, is that so? That is truly something to celebrate." "Really?" "I was shocked by the sudden announcement, but please take care of your health." "Congratulations on your pregnancy." I expressed my joy from the heart. However, Kate's face looked displeased, as if she was not convinced. Knowing that I was undergoing fertility treatment, she might have intentionally announced her pregnancy at this timing. Despite Kate's announcement, I was not shocked, rather. I sincerely congratulated her on her pregnancy. Later, Greg and Kate had a daughter, and we continued our efforts with fertility treatments. After 3 years of treatment, we finally had a daughter. It was the last in vitro fertilization attempt after deciding to live just the two of us, and our daughter joined our family. During the treatment, Robert suggested me to quit my job due to the commuting and emotional burdens, so I stayed at home as a housewife. Thus, I avoided conversations with Kate that could contain sarcasm and minimized contact with her as much as possible. However, with the birth of our daughter, my feelings changed, and visits to my parents' home began to increase again. "Hey Susan, your child has such small eyes that it's a bit pitiful." "Oh, but both of you have small eyes too, right?" The first comment she made upon meeting my daughter was characteristically inconsiderate. At that moment, I strongly felt again that I wanted to avoid any relationship with this person. Kate always wanted to make herself look good. "Don't worry about it. Don't worry. I'm not bothered." Thanks to my mother's consoling after Kate's sarcastic remarks, I managed to maintain a calm demeanor. "Mother, can I take this rice home?" "Oh, I just bought new rice." "Don't be so stingy. We're out of rice at home, haha." Before my mother could agree, Kate had already taken the bag of rice and left the house. According to my troubled mother, she visits several times a week and takes away groceries and daily necessities without permission. I was only surprised by Kate's unreasonable behavior. Amidst these daily events, I received news from my mother that my father had suddenly collapsed. He was still active as a doctor, working hard every day for his patients. Considering his age, I went to the hospital to suggest retirement, but when I arrived, he was as energetic as ever. I was momentarily confused but quickly relieved. However, before I could relax, my mother started talking. "Susan, actually, your father has cancer." "What? Cancer?" "He just got brought in? How can you know that so soon?" "We've actually been hiding it. He's had cancer for a while." I was speechless at this shocking revelation. "Dad, did you know about the cancer?" "As a doctor, yes. But by the time I noticed, it was too late. I probably have around 3 months left." Normally cheerful and optimistic, my father was slightly infuriating that day. "Dad, why didn't you tell us sooner?" I said that while tearing up. "I wanted to minimize the time you all would be sad." "I'm really sorry." My father seemed regretful and apologized. "I want to spend my final days at home. It might be a bother, but is that okay?" "Of course." "I want to be with you too, Dad. I'll discuss it with Robert and come back home." Thus, I decided to spend some time at my parents' home, spending time by their side. My daughter, living 2 hours away by train, visited several times to see my father, which greatly pleased him. Robert, amidst his busy work schedule, helped greatly by shopping and keeping my father company. I shared this situation with Greg and Kate, but after previously visiting often, they completely stopped showing up. A few days later, my father invited both our family and Greg's family to the house. I'm sorry, but there's something about the inheritance I need to discuss. As my father said that, Greg and Kate's eyes lit up. In fact, my assets are about $5 million. Everyone, except for my mother, was shocked by the unexpected amount. Further inquiry revealed that in addition to his income as a doctor, my father had built up a considerable amount through stock investments. I want to carefully consider this matter until my time comes and make a final decision. I'd appreciate your cooperation. Of course, Dad. Greg, who hadn't even shown his face during the visits, responded, and I could barely contain my anger. Father, aren't you in pain? Maybe you should lie down for a bit. Kate began to ingratiate herself, using the situation. Afterward, the couple visited my father daily, changing sheets and replenishing medicines, and acted devotedly. While feeling uncomfortable with their changed attitude, I remained silent as my father was pleased. One day, as my parents and I returned from the hospital, someone was in the living room. Looking at the shoes, they belonged to Greg and Kate. Without paying much attention, I headed to the living room with my father and overheard my brother and his wife's conversation. $5 million is incredible. Dad will be gone soon, so let's just endure it for a while longer. You are terrible, Greg, aren't you? Although, lately I may have been viewing him solely in terms of financial worth. But I heard he only had 3 months left, and he still seems healthy. I wonder how long we'll need to care for him. My brother and his wife were having a discomforting conversation. Seeing my father's sad face next to me caused me pain. Unable to remain silent upon seeing my father like this, I was about to head to the living room when he grabbed my hand and shook his head. Don't worry. There's just one thing I need help with. My father said that. The next day, Greg and Kate came to visit my father again and started various caregiving tasks. You both must be busy, there's no need to come anymore. But Dad, considering all that you've done for us, we want to repay you. Even though they may seem like a family on the surface, Greg was only thinking about money. Father's face was clearly lonely. I really was given 3 months to live, but it's been 4 months now. You must be eager for the inheritance. Greg and Kate seemed surprised by those words. Oh, Father, that's not true at all. If possible, we want you to live longer. Kate quickly countered. Maybe, were you eavesdropping on our conversation yesterday? What conversation? Were you saying something bad? From a lonely expression, Father laughed as if to tease. Watching them, the way the two became active and hurried was indescribably interesting. On the following day, Robert left work early to join us for dinner at our house. Hello. Father, I brought some delicious-looking grapes. Let's chill and enjoy them later. Oh, what magnificent fruits, can't wait to eat them. Thanks. Father seemed very pleased with Robert's visit. Robert quickly helped prepare the dinner, and we all sat down at the table. Then, Robert broached the subject. I heard that Greg quit his job, did you hear anything? We were surprised by his question and couldn't answer. It seems like it was more like he was fired. More than him quitting on his own. Really? What happened? It became clear that Greg's work performance had been deteriorating, and he had been frequently reprimanded. Moreover, recently his behavior worsened, and after angering a client he had a big argument with his direct supervisor, which ultimately led him to resign. That recently is actually after I mentioned the inheritance. That timing might match up. Yes, it's a shame he caused trouble for the company and Robert as well. Father apologized. That child used to be such a good boy, but somehow he changed. Father's face has been filled with sadness recently, and it's been very hard to see. Sorry to bring this up. The delicious food will get cold. Robert, really thank you. We are so happy you joined our family. At those words, Robert nodded with a smile. "All right, I've made up my mind. I need everyone's cooperation." With that declaration, Father stood up, leaning on his cane, and handed over something. When we saw the contents of the envelope, we were surprised by Father's explanation, but we agreed to the plan and promised to cooperate. 2 weeks later, Father passed away, watched over by Mother, me, and Robert. We couldn't get in touch with Greg and Kate, and they were absent during that crucial moment. Father's death brought deep sadness, but we were grateful to have spent his last days together. Father had posted the funeral notice at the hospital where he worked. On the day of the funeral, many people whom Father had cared for gathered. We realized how much Father was loved by many people. After settling down post-funeral, the topic of the inheritance came up. Right after Father's death, Greg immediately brought up the topic of the estate. "Greg, Father just passed away, and you're talking about this? Everyone grieves differently, but it's hard for me, having lost my husband. But we need to hurry with the estate matters." I was disappointed by Kate's lack of understanding of my mother's feelings. If only they would just keep quiet, really terrible people. After living so long, they haven't learned anything. It was rare for Robert to raise his voice in anger. They were surprised by his reaction. "Neither of you deserves to receive his inheritance," Greg retorted with a flushed face. "What? You earn a high salary, you don't need the inheritance." "Calm down, Greg, we have a trip to Hawaii next week. For now, let's just split the $5 million inheritance." With that, Kate, looking angry, took Greg and went home. I can't believe those two, planning a trip to Hawaii at a time like this. It's rare for Robert to get so angry. "Thank you. I'm embarrassed at my son, but I regret how I raised him. Even at this age, I'm saddened that I have to cause my mother distress. But don't worry. Those two will have hell to come." Before they left for Hawaii, they handed over their bank details to us, instructing us to transfer the inheritance there. A few days later, while my mother and I were clearing up Father's belongings, they returned. Hawaii was really wonderful. "Here, a souvenir for you." They handed over a can of macadamia nuts. Accepting the souvenir, I felt it was better than nothing. "How's the inheritance?" "We'd like our bank card back," they demanded. I handed them the bank card. "Ha! I can't see the money in the account." "What do you mean?" "It hasn't increased since we withdrew money before the trip," they protested. "Haven't you divided the inheritance yet?" they asked. "It's divided. Look properly. There should be $1,000 in each of your accounts," I replied. "Hey Mom, what's this about $1,000? They reacted mockingly, but my mother and I remained calm. "This date, it's from before Father passed, isn't it?" they pointed out. "That's right. The distribution of the inheritance is already complete," I explained. As they looked surprised, I showed them Father's will. In the will, the majority of the estate was left to my mother and me, $500,000 each. Greg received only $1,000, and the rest was donated to pediatric medicine. "What is this? This isn't what we agreed," Greg exploded in anger. "Hey brother, did Father ever ask you to sign any special documents?" "Yes, I did sign. Dad said he was leaving me $5 million. "Really? Did you actually check what that document was about?" "It's just like you, signing without reading anything." I laughed while teasing Greg. "That document was a deed of renunciation of the inheritance. By signing it, you ended up getting nothing." "What? That's too harsh. At that time, Dad did tell you to check the contents carefully, but you just assumed it was about receiving $5 million and signed without verifying." Hearing this, Greg was shocked and lost color in his face. Next to him, Kate was causing a commotion. "I quit my job thinking I was going to receive $5 million, and I've already spent all my savings. Greg is an important son to his mother, so Yoey will at least give us $100,000.
Right.
Kate also desperately sought help from my mother. "I'm sorry. but that's impossible. I can't give a single penny to people who only see money. The $1,000 was his last act of kindness. Use it wisely." With that, my mother, holding back tears, left the scene. "What are we going to do now, Greg?" As Kate started making a fuss again, Greg just stood there, dazed. "Look, give me half of your $500,000. "There's no way I can do that. You've always belittled our family, you've even taken daily necessities and food from Mom. I'm done dealing with you." Normally quiet, I exploded with anger and shouted loudly, "Now, if you understand, leave immediately. And never come back to this house." Unable to argue, the astonished brother and sister-in-law were driven out of the house, and I firmly locked the front door, feeling a definitive sense of closure. As a result, following the will, my brother and sister-in-law were left with only $1,000. Greg, having quit his job, lost his income to support the household, struggled to make even the small mortgage payments, and eventually they lost their home and had to move. Despite several visits to our family home, my once angry mother never forgave their actions. Local rumors suggest that they sought financial help from their daughter, but she, knowing all the details from my daughter, denied their requests and turned them away. As a result, my brother and sister-in-law, now discredited by everyone, live in a small apartment with a rent of $300 per month, barely getting by with day labor. A friend of Robert reported seeing them at the market looking terribly emaciated, pale as if the life had been drained from them, much like a spent candle. On the other hand, I used the inheritance from my father to carry out a major renovation of the aging family home several years ago, starting a new life with my mother. We redesigned every room to be barrier-free to ensure that my elderly mother could live without any difficulties, creating a safe and comfortable environment. And most surprisingly and joyfully, my daughter gave birth to a healthy baby boy, my first grandchild. My mother was overjoyed to see her great-grandchild, and recently, we have found great joy in playing with my grandson in the park. After years of hoping, a peaceful and calm life has finally become a reality. From now on, I sincerely hope to spend relaxed and fulfilling days with my precious family and friends.